Hello, and welcome to the Sustainability Leaders Podcast, part of the Jobs with Impact compendium of resources for people who want to make a positive impact on the world. I'm David Rosenheim, your host. Every week, we bring you in-depth conversations with people who are leading the way to a sustainable future. I hope these conversations will be as inspiring to you as they are to me, and most of all, I hope that they'll empower you to take action. The planet needs you. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to jobswithimpact.com. This episode is part of the California Leadership Series, where we focus on changemakers in California government who are shaping the most innovative energy and climate policy anywhere, transforming the world's fifth largest economy and beyond. Our sustainable business sponsor for the California Leadership Series is Lyft. Lyft is the fastest growing rideshare company in the U.S. and is available to 95% of the U.S. population. Lyft is preferred by drivers and passengers for its reliable and friendly experience and its commitment to effecting positive change for the future of our cities as the first rideshare company to launch a carbon offset program. And now, all Lyft rides are carbon neutral. To learn more, visit lyft.com/carbon. Hi, everyone. This week, we're going to talk about energy. Before we get into it, I'd just like to ask that you take a minute to give us a rating or review in iTunes and let your friends know about the Sustainability Leaders podcast. I really appreciate it. The California energy sector is a complex organism that is going through a major upheaval on its way from a past that relied heavily on large point sources and a monodirectional grid with scant renewables as recently as 20 years ago, to a rapidly arriving future of many distributed sources, microgrids, and now, with the signing into law of SB 100, we must have 100% clean energy by the year 2045. Overseeing the strategy for implementing this massive shift to a clean grid is the chairman of the California Energy Commission, Bob Weisenmiller. The commission he oversees is responsible for a range of critical energy issues, from advancing energy efficiency and renewable energy to investing in energy innovation and transforming the state's transportation sector. Weisenmiller brings deep experience to the post in which he has served since Governor Brown first appointed him in 2011. This role brings him full circle to an agency where he first served as a staffer under Brown's first administration in the late 70s. In the 30-year interim, Weisenmiller assisted businesses, financial institutions, regulators, and many others in understanding and navigating California's intricate energy markets. I met with Bob in his Sacramento office to discuss his early days as a doctoral chemistry student at Berkeley, his wide and varied career in the energy sector, and his outlook on green jobs and the future of energy and climate in the world's fifth largest economy. Well, Chairman Weisenmiller, thank you very much for joining us today on the podcast.
Right.
I appreciate your time. So I'd love to start at your beginnings and understand your path. I know that you're from Maryland and tobacco country.
Exactly, yeah. Southern Maryland.
Tell me about your childhood and what it was like growing up there.
Yeah, well, it was a much different era there. You know, as I said, it was a farmland. Right now it's all wall-to-wall suburbia. It was, in many respects, the Old South. So it's a very segregated society. I was going to say, not particularly great educational opportunities there. But, I basically worked hard, studied hard in school and made the transition. And followed every opportunity I had to learn.
Now, were you drawn early on to science?
Yeah, actually, when I was first of all, my generation, you had the Sputnik era, and that sense that somehow the U.S. had gotten behind, and particularly in the sciences. And I actually remember in high school, the chemistry book was actually put together by George Pimentel. George was a famous Berkeley chemist. And again, is that sense from the Sputnik era that somehow, they really needed to get the best scientists working on education and developing that. And, so I looked at, the chemistry, the math, the physics, all the science stuff I just found frankly pretty easy. And certainly there's a wide variety of things I found interesting. But, it's pretty clear what your career path was there. And, like, what do you do with an English degree, or what do you do with a history degree? So basically,
you do podcasts.
Podcast. Anyway, certainly I like to read her stuff, but it was like, okay, I can understand how this was going to translate. And so, this was my undergraduate major was in chemistry. And again, it was like I just found the sciences to be one way of trying to understand the physical world.
And so you studied initially on the East Coast at Providence College.
That's correct, yeah.
And came west for your graduate work at Berkeley. What brought you west?
So in my junior year when I was at Providence College, I got an internship opportunity at Berkeley in nuclear chemistry, actually at the 88-inch cyclotron, which is why I ultimately came back to do my degree. And it was such a contrast between basically New England and Berkeley, and such a contrast. This was, there was a group of people there who were very good scientists, who were certainly socially motivated, and the weather was so much different. I was ready to fly back to Washington D.C., where it was going to be about 95 degrees and about 95% humidity. And at least at that point, Berkeley was, more like 60 something. And I was wondering why I was going back.
Talk to me for a second about this idea of socially minded science. What was germinating there?
Well, this was something, and it certainly became much sharper when I got to Berkeley. But, even at Providence College, we were pretty much, that was when the early environmental movement was really coming to the fore. We had the first Earth Day was pretty much when I was graduating from college. And, there was certainly Rachel Carson. There was any number of indications that if you were a scientist, that we really had to be thinking much more about science in the, how that fit into the overall society. And, that was, again, it was a pretty formative period, as you remember, back in the 70s. Just as I was getting ready to graduate was where we had, 4 kids killed at Kent State. Yeah. So it was pretty hard to just say, let's go into the laboratory and stay with the test tubes. But you had to look at the much broader context.
And you were studying nuclear chemistry
Right.
is what you did your PhD at Berkeley. And
Right. That was, it was, I had been in the physical chemistry area, organic chemistry. And the thing I just remembered going through Providence College was at the very last year, we were doing some pretty complicated synthesis stuff. So you would go in and you'd work with something and say, oh yeah, this is really hazardous, and at the end of it, we're going to dispose of it, but be very careful because it's highly flammable or it's poisonous or something. And you're going, why am I doing this? How does this really fit? And is there some other way to pursue the chemistry options? So, basically, the cyclotron was much more interesting in that you combine very sophisticated electronics. Certainly, it's a very complicated device, a cyclotron.
What is it? Can you explain it to me?
Well, basically, what it does, and this, the first cyclotron really at Lawrence Berkeley Lab was Macmillan got a Nobel Prize for it. And the idea was that you start these particles rotating, and by having them in circles, you can give them an extra push of energy as each time they go around. And so you can accelerate things to very high energy. And then what we did, particularly in my thesis, was we looked we were trying to look at the relationship between protons and neutrons and how, with a nuclear force fundamentally. And one way to really test the force was to look at nuclei with large excesses of neutrons. So most of the time, particularly Berkeley's always had an approach of trying to really look at elements. One of the things Glenn Seaborg did when he was at Berkeley was that he synthesized plutonium, other, berkelium, other advanced elements. So basically he was adding more and more protons to very heavy nuclei. What we were doing was adding more and more neutrons to very light nuclei. Things like lithium, I explored like lithium 10 and 11, and most lithium is like 6 or 7. So we're adding like 4 extra neutrons. And so the question is, what happens in the nuclear force and how similar is it? And so it was very esoteric. I mean, it's one of the things I found, when you're going out in the social scene, trying to describe to people what you're doing, and you're going, eventually saying, well, why am I, it's fun. It's very challenging, pushing the real envelope in a number of ways, but why am I doing it? And, part of it was just as in that one era, the idea was Sputnik, was certainly nuclear power / energy has always been something which, the U.S. really put a large investment in that, and they really wanted to get the best and brightest in that area. So we had really good facilities. We worked really hard, but for grad students, we were pretty well paid for grad students, bottom line. But, it was definitely one of those things where you're expected to work 60, 70 hours a week,
And I guess the promise really was affordable, perpetual energy for.
Oh yeah, no, that was certainly part of it, and at the same time we were struggling because obviously nuclear energy, and when you thought about it, that the people in that field, you basically knew how to make atom bombs. Mm-hmm. When I did my thesis oral exams in the second year, the chemistry professor who led the committee shortly after that was the war in Israel, and he left to work on the Israeli bomb. So, there's always a pretty clear connection between weaponry, nuclear power, and the science. So that really led you thinking about, the social issues of the science more than if I had been in other areas of chemistry.
And how did that thinking about the social impacts kind of influence your direction?
Yeah, well, actually, one of the things which we ran into early, it's remarkable how things have changed. But at one point, a number of us wanted to have a seminar at LBNL on the anti-ballistic missiles, and the director just got very upset. Yeah, the notion was that was more political than pure science. Mm. And fortunately, Owen Chamberlain, who had actually gotten a Nobel Prize, was one of the group organizing this event. So they gave us a certain amount of immunity. You had, it's one thing for grad students, another thing for your Nobel Prize,
right.
Scientists to really humor them, shall we say. Mm-hmm. So I think, anyway, early on, a lot of us were thinking, in Berkeley, on the one hand, at that point, it was the top chemistry department in the country. It historically had been very, very conservative. But, in that era, you had a youthful group that were much more socially aware, shall we say, and environmentally concerned. So it was an interesting contrast generally in the department.
That's interesting because one does not associate Berkeley with conservatism at all, and I guess that earlier era is sort of forgotten.
Definitely. When Oppenheimer had his trial on security clearance was lifted, but one of the witnesses was Edward Lawrence, mm-hmm. and he had been certainly a leading chemist at Berkeley. So a number of the leading chemists really went after Oppenheimer at that point. But at the same time, there was this tension where Lawrence Berkeley Lab really never did classified work. There was some during the Manhattan Project, but everything else was not. And the classified work was always done at Livermore. It was the bottom line. So much different orientations between the two labs.
Okay, so let's move forward from the Berkeley days, and
one of the things that really changed things for me. So I was in chemistry, the working PhD program, and that was when, after the first oil embargo, basically Berkeley decided it would set up an interdisciplinary energy program. and it hired John Holdren. John had been at Caltech and did some work at Livermore, but John was basically, they brought him in to set up courses in energy, and I started taking those. It's sort of spare time. I would go down on campus, and frankly, I'd taken classes in some of the physics department to understand some of the astrophysics better. So when the energy opportunity came up, I just went down to take those. And initially, there was like 4 or 5 people in the class, pretty small group. And eventually, John asked me to TA one of the classes, so I did that, and developed started getting more and more interest in energy stuff. And then eventually, Art Rosenfeld, and Art was one of the leading physicists there, and it really switched over to energy. And Art made a proposal to the Energy Commission to develop basically a way of forecasting energy demand that could reflect the policy choices people made. If they did building standards or if they did appliance standards, how that would affect energy. And it was a totally different type of model, and no one was sure you could do it. So basically, he proposed to the Energy Commission he would do that. And the next question is how to deliver. And so Art had a really brilliant grad student, Dave Goldstein, and Dave and I had met in Holdren's classes. He had TA'd one of them I took. I had TA'd one he had taken. And so Dave got the assignment to do this model. Dave pulled me in for the summer, along with others, and we basically created it. So I took sort of a leave of absence from chemistry, helped develop the model, which parts of it are still, actually, it was a foundation for what the Energy Commission does now. And then went back and finished off my thesis in chemistry.
So let me just ask one question about the model. I mean, it sounds like it's an economic model.
Well, what we did was that most forecasting historically was econometrics. Mm-hmm. So you would look at key variables, things like the economy, the weather, and forecast demand. And what we said was, you really, as you start changing the building stock, you really need to develop a stock of what were all the buildings in California like, which ones were energy efficient, which ones weren't, which ones had energy efficient refrigerators, which ones didn't. So very complicated stock flow model, basically. Mm-hmm. And so the question in part was, could you ever get the data to develop the model? And I did the buildings part while David did the appliance part. And as it eventually, at that point, I wrote Fortran coding for the buildings part. It was funny because I thought of things as a nuclear chemist. So it was all sort of nuclear decay rates for buildings and stuff, which, as I said, when I came to the Energy Commission in 77, sometime like 82, I looked and said, God, this is the model I wrote. It was part of the model was for the programming I'd written at that time.
That's fascinating.
So I'm afraid to check now, frankly, but
afraid to check if
it's still what we're using today.
Right.
But yeah,
right. So your first tour of the Energy Commission was back in the late 70s, when Governor Brown's first administration was in place.
Yeah, no, it was. The question is, what do you? So here I am. I'm graduating from Berkeley. By then, I'd gotten not just the PhD in chemistry, but I'd gotten a master's in energy and resources. And I said that I really wasn't going to continue on a chemistry pathway, which would have meant get a postdoc someplace, probably Oxford, frankly. But, look for what was I going to do with an energy degree. And, that was actually one of the things the university has struggled with setting up the energy and resources program was, could you ever get a job if you had a degree in energy? And at that point, the Energy Commission its roots came back to 74, when, in fact, Governor Reagan signed the legislation setting up the Energy Commission. Originally, he had vetoed the bill. Then the oil embargo occurred, and he wanted to do something on energy. Mm. So he negotiated with Charlie Warren and Al Lockwitz, the two authors, and developed basically the Energy Commission. And then when Governor Brown came in, he appointed the first 5 commissioners. And so as this Energy Commission has this joint history of, on the one hand, Ronald Reagan, on the other hand, Jerry Brown. And certainly Reagan would have appointed much different commissioners than Jerry did. And so when I started looking around, one of the commissioners was basically a RAND scientist. And again, like me, he had started out as basically a physicist and had worked on basically what happens if you use nuclear power in space, and had done various calculations, and then was surprised when basically accidents occurred and the radiation was spilled out. And so Ron had then worked on, the legislature had given RAND contracts to really model California's energy future. And one of them was pretty famous for saying, with the direction we were going, unless we did other things, we would have a nuclear power plant every 15 miles up and down the coast. And said, well, there were alternatives. So Ron was the leading author of that. So he was one of the first appointees to the Energy Commission. And so I ended up working with Ron when I came into the commission. And of the commissioners at the time, it was a pretty disparate lot, but Ron was really the leading environmentalist on the commission. And it was a pretty critical time. Ron was in charge of doing the first building standards. When I was working for Ron, we had basically we dealt with a nuclear power plant at Sun Desert, whether or not to approve that. We dealt with, we intervened in the PUC case. The question is whether we need an LNG terminal at Point Conception. I mean, it was just.
What was the vision, the energy vision from an environmental perspective at that time? I mean, now it's all about climate. And,
right. Well, at that point, again, it was pretty much saying, I guess the way to most fundamentally describe it was a couple of things. First of all, you get back to this. On the one hand, you have this pretty stark vision that you're going to need nuclear power plants all the way up and down the coast, or coal plants. And at the same time, you had the oil embargo. So you were trying to move off of oil. And the belief was we were running out of natural gas. So SoCalGas in 76, 77 said there was going to be 600,000 people out of work in Southern California because we didn't have natural gas.
Wow. And
that's where we had to bring in LNG. And so that meant we were shifting from oil, because most power plants at that point were oil fired, with phenomenal, consequences in terms of air quality. Yeah. But also, when the oil embargoes occurred, suddenly, we didn't. What was the availability, and what was the prices were going up dramatically. And certainly one of the hallmarks in 77, 78, the Iranian embargo, was these lines at gas stations, where you're going to have gasoline. I remember the first time I met the governor was, a cabinet meeting, and there's trying to go, okay, what are we going to do tomorrow? What's it look like at the, in terms of the truck stations and stuff, the trucks and traffic. So it was just really this sense that we, we're running out of stuff, and and that led to also the theory that the Energy Commission, one of our jobs was one-stop siting, so that the idea was that we go through, figure out somehow how many power plants we needed, what the alternatives were, that to go to people and say, look, we've done energy efficiency, we've looked at R&D, we've done everything we can, but we still need this amount, and we've got to cite those, and we're going to do it fast. And it turned out, in part, there were a lot more options. And as oil prices went up and price of energy went up, people's use of energy went down.
And was the commission at that time, what was the state of energy efficiency? Was the commission engaged in energy efficiency? Was energy efficiency a thing?
Well, that was one of the fundamental things we did. Again, the notion we had, and it was something I came up with at that point, was to say, we don't live to consume energy, right? We need energy services. We need lights. We need heating. We need cooling. We need power for our industry or whatever. But per se, it's not like you really want to use electricity. You really want to use natural gas.
Right. Not for the sake of using it. Yeah.
Right. And so, if there were better ways to do that, if you could have a more efficient building, if you could have more efficient lighting. And so, we did it's since become pretty conventional, but we were the first ones to do appliance efficiency standards. It was in the law. We did them for refrigerators. We did them for air conditioners, and ever since then, we've been doing, more and more appliances and finding that if you looked at the life cycle cost, that it was, you could have a much more efficient, say, refrigerator than, if you just put a shoddy refrigerator in, use lots of energy later, it might cost less initially, but over the lifetime, you'd be much better off with a more efficient refrigerator or a more efficient air conditioner. And we did similar analysis on buildings. And part of the rationale for why an agency should do that is that, sort of many people buy their house, the builders put in the air conditioner, the refrigerator, the various devices, and they want the cheapest things they could put in, cheapest first cost.
Right.
Or maybe you don't know that, the 4 different types of refrigerators, that you're looking at, one of them, when you look at it from that life cycle basis, is much more efficient. So the same on buildings, again, if you're housing in California, if you get choice between house A and B, why would the builder make it particularly airtight? In fact, that was when I started, the federal government had some degree of standards on construction, but they wanted the same usage throughout the country. So the notion was, how do you have the same amount of energy used to heat a house in California and in Minnesota? Well, the California house is a lot more, a lot leakier, a lot less efficient. And so it was pretty clear, again, if you went through and, basically made a tighter house, it would be more comfortable. And again, what you really care about is how comfortable is the house, not, how much energy can I use in it.
Right.
So
how comfortable and what the costs are.
What the costs are. Yeah. So, that was a fundamental change. I think actually the first ones were really done by the community development, and within the Energy Commission did its first round. Ron was in charge and really tightened things up. It turned out to be pretty we went through one of those downturns in the economy as the Governor Brown's term was ending. So basically, we suddenly found that the builders couldn't build houses, so they could look at our standards and show up in California in the legislature and yell about them. Mm-hmm. So they were actually postponed. The governor took a duck and postponed them a year to sort of get them through. But it was if you look at energy, so at that point it was pretty much shortages, price, and we had like, how many nuclear plants do you want in California? How many coal plants? Again, if you think about it, at that point there was a proposal. PG&E had proposed a coal plant, basically at Montezuma, which is where the Dow plant was. The Bay Area now, where all the wind machines are. Yeah. It would have been a very large coal plant. There would have been coal cars coming through Sacramento every day by train. There was Edison had its coal plant proposed in the desert, and there was another one, Harry Allen Warner Valley, which we got involved in, which again was a very 2,000 megawatt coal plant near the national parks. So, and we actually, Energy Commission was pretty aggressive on the environmental side at that point. In fact, we came within one vote of being abolished by the legislature because the fear was that we had basically stopped the Sun Desert nuclear plant. And there had been a law that said unless we could determine that nuclear waste could be safely stored, we couldn't permit any more nuclear plants in California. There were a couple that were grandfathered around that. So first we made the finding you couldn't store the waste. And then we made the finding that, in fact, for the Sun Desert plant, that there were other options you could pursue instead. So again, the conventional thinking had been a number of nuclear power plants in California, a number of coal plants, getting away from oil. And again, we're talking coal plants in California, but also mine mouth coal plants. So having stopped or slowed down that drive, we weren't that popular in the legislature, frankly. And I give Governor Brown a lot of credit for standing by us as we went through that. But it was a controversial time, I guess, the bottom line.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of things which are now pretty conventional wisdom just were not then.
Were not at all. And Governor Brown was running for president.
Yeah,
and you did some work on sort of creating his energy platform.
Yeah, no, basically, again, so imagine Governor Brown is running for president. 3 Mile Island has just happened. And so after we basically stopped Sun Desert and people were ready to abolish us, 3 Mile Island happens and everyone sort of steps back and takes a breath. Maybe it was the right decision. But then the Iranian oil embargo comes, and I said, you have lines at the gas stations. And so at that point, Dick Silverman was governor's chief of staff and said, okay, he needs a comprehensive energy policy to run for president. Basically the notion was that we would look at how to transform the utilities from basically selling electricity to basically selling conservation. That was something, certainly the PUC was moving in that direction, but not as aggressively as they ultimately did. And, basically set up prices for independent power producers for like cogeneration and renewables.
But this was before decoupling.
And part of it was decoupling too. So basically we went before the PUC and proposed, and at that point the PUC was not very innovative from a staff perspective. So like I had gone down and testified before the PUC and said, well, they should do avoided cost pricing for QFs. And the PUC staffer had said no, and then basically the commissioners put on another PUC staffer who agreed with me, and they adopted that concept. Similarly, the Energy Commission, had gone down and testified before the PUC saying they should decouple sales from revenue so the utility would not have incentives or disincentives from energy efficiency, and also that the rate should be flipped, basically marginal cost pricing. So as you use more, you should pay more. So we flipped it to the structure where rates, instead of declining as you use more, would basically increase as you use more. So it was a time of transformation, and a lot of the ideas came from here, and a lot of them were embedded in sort of the package I put together for the governor initially. And obviously, once he looked at them and it went through cabinet meetings, went through discussions, and got refined and shaped, and certainly reflected his interest. Then, once you have the governor saying, I want to go in this direction, then telling the agencies, like one of the things we wanted to do with general services was to really make the state buildings an example of what to do, right?
A special thanks to our sustainable business sponsor for the California Leadership Series, Lyft. Lyft is the fastest growing rideshare company in the U.S. and is available to 95% of the U.S. population. Now, all Lyft rides are carbon neutral. This means that a decision to ride with Lyft is a decision to take a cleaner option, cleaner than driving yourself or riding with another company, and will fund efforts that are reducing emissions and combating climate change. This is a multi-million-dollar investment in the first year alone, which makes Lyft one of the top voluntary purchasers of carbon offsets in the world. In year one, Lyft anticipates offsetting over 1 million tons of carbon, equivalent to planting tens of millions of trees or taking hundreds of thousands of cars off the road. Lyft's investment and impact will continue to grow as the company does. Ride Lyft and join together in effecting positive change for the future of our cities. To learn more, visit lyft.com/carbon.
So this is one of the results, which was certainly a very innovative energy building. And
describe, since this is an audio podcast, describe the building that we're sitting in now at the Energy Commission.
Well, right now, even with now, you've got very thick cement walls. So in terms of Sacramento, it's hot, but it's not particularly hot in here. We have the interior atrium, Unfortunately, we had a budget crisis at the very end, so it's not enclosed really, but it would have a much different feeling. We used efficient lighting, everything we could do to make this a very efficient building for circa late 70s. And again, we had the Energy Commission initially. So back when Governor Reagan was governor, the notion was to get everyone out of the downtown, get them out into the suburbs.
Right.
Close down the mansion, the governor's mansion, get the suburban mansion, just all that direction. So when we first set up the Energy Commission, we were out on Howe Avenue with just a typical suburban office building, right? And so then we got to come down here just at the end of the administration to something that really, symbolized at the time a lot more creativity on the energy efficiency side. It had solar thermal up on the roof. Just a lot of different features, which for the times were pretty aggressive.
So walking the walk.
Yeah, exactly. And again, that was the notion, was we had to do that. But at the same time, one of the governor's initiatives, having said a lot about energy, was he really wanted to revitalize the downtown, and to really get housing down here, and just the whole, basically his theory that we had to move away from, having growth throughout the states.
The sprawl.
Yeah. And sort of revitalize.
And that's a process that continues. Talk to me, since you were here at the beginning of the formation, or around the beginning of the formation of the Energy Commission. The focus that we have with these conversations is one of career, and we're talking about your career. But talk about the sorts of people that actually work at the Energy Commission, the various sort of professions that are housed here, and what the career paths look like.
No, that's a great question. So for the Energy Commission, again, we've gone through all kinds of transformations on the staffing, but we have just a real range of skills. So if you look at the siting program, say, so for siting, we have power plant engineers. We have to look at the safety and the reliability of the power plants. We have we have to look at 24 different findings on the environmental impact. So, we have to do a very comprehensive CEQA analysis. So as you go through and say, okay, we need someone who understands, wildflowers, we need someone who understands marine mammal. It's just, you go through anything in desert tortoise, it's just seismic issues. It's just really very broad on all the, I'm going to say, basic science of environmental impacts. So we have, a whole group of people who do that, along with a detailed engineering analysis. So that's a group. Now, another group when you get to the energy efficiency. Now, again, when we talk about building science or, appliances, so we need very good engineers for that part. We also need, so we have to show it's cost effective. So, you just think through all the skill mix you need on going through and looking at lighting, looking at buildings, looking at TVs, looking at, all the basic appliances. Think about the sort of science and engineers you need. Then you need economists who can go through and say, okay, from a life cycle cost basis, does this make sense? How do you go through the economics of that? Then you're going to need both the cases that was talked about, the regulations. You need some pretty good lawyers,
right?
Who are going to go through the process. But you also need people thinking about the social economic impacts. So again, it's a very broad skill mix. And, as you go through things, I've just gone through we have a research division. So again, we need research scientists in climate. We need research scientists in terms of how to really help transform California, in terms of as we get these innovations. One is to get the innovations in the lab, but then how do you get those into business? How do you, look at incubators? How do you put that together? How do you get people to actually adapt that? So we have a lot of social science, and then as you go along on renewables, we have a renewable division that's sort of certifying. So we need people with skills in all the renewable technologies, but also in terms of what about people, what's their appetite for using it? We have another group involved in trying to transform the transportation sector. So we need people who understand zero electric vehicles, charging, alternative fuels, hydrogen, just all the transformative technologies mobility, right? It's how much of it is technology, how much is going to autonomous vehicles. And, we need experts on all that. We do a lot of grants. So we did, like, for Prop 39, we gave total $1.8 million, $1 billion in grants to local schools in California to install energy efficiency solar. So we need people who can actually run the contracts, right? And say, okay, we'll
do the community outreach and stakeholder outreach. So what is the total staff size?
We have about 700 people.
700 people.
And again, it's not that, but your question was, the skill mix.
Yeah.
So
it's pretty diverse.
It's pretty diverse, but a common pathway in here is interns. And a lot of the interns are obviously from the schools in this area, although we certainly try to reach out. Stanford has a pretty good internship program for us. They send people up every summer. But again, to say, okay, why don't you come in? And I can point to people who came in here as interns. And like one woman was an intern when I was here in 1978. She was working in the nuclear area. She ultimately became executive director. So, again, you develop the skills. We need people to really be trained broadly. So, you could come in and be our expert on transmission planning, and just work your way through that for 25 years. Or, you could start as an intern. And she was in nuclear, I'm not sure I could go through the various spots she went through. I was commissioner advisor, but, like I said, ultimately became executive director. So, again, it's a lot of opportunities for folks. There have been waves. It's a really good time now. When I came in, it was a very good time because there weren't that many people with energy backgrounds. A lot of people were coming over from other state agencies, but coming with an energy degree, it was a pretty good pathway through the building. This point, the original round of people who were here with me 40 years ago, most of them are gone, and so, again, that transformation, there's just a lot of opportunities for people to come into the Energy Commission now.
I was talking with Commissioner Peterman at the CPUC a couple of weeks ago, and she mentioned that the generational change that's taking place is quite significant, and the amount of new opportunities available now and over the next few years is pretty astounding.
It is. And the other thing is, frankly, like when I came, I thought I was going to be here originally for 2 years. I was here for 5 years. And when you look at
the first time,
yeah,
right.
But when you looked at compensation and other things, again, it was pretty. A number of people I knew who came in, some actually stayed. I guess is what I'm saying. Others moved on into other areas, of the state. Some went to the PUC. Someone went into private. It's not like coming here that someone has to say, yeah, this is my career choice.
But it's a great foundation for doing work across the energy sector. So let's come back to your trajectory. So you were here in the first tour for 5 years, and then you built a couple of consultancies.
Exactly. So
working in this
I was
space.
here for 5 years, and I spent 1 year as a commissioner advisor. I spent 2 years. I set up an office in the commission, and then. For the last 2 years after working in the governor's energy policy, I had an office, an executive office that did policy development and program evaluation. So I went through the budget. When I had concluded after 5 years, it was time to move on. Now, having said that, after I left in November, when Duke Majan came in January, he just eliminated my position, my whole office. So there was no coming back. Was the bottom line. I had gone into setting up basically a small business. Originally, it was focusing on, and there were several of us who had been in the Brown administration who had gotten, again, when you get to the end of the administration, it's time to look around. It's not unusual for people to jump. So we'd gone in that direction, was trying to develop, basically it was pretty clear that the future was going to be power, cogeneration and renewables. So we were moving into that space, figuring from the policy background, we could figure out how to make a living there. We were doing that in consulting. Eventually, it turned out most of the consulting clients are ones who were trying to develop small power, so you couldn't do both. So then we basically went from one company to basically two companies, and I went off on the consulting firm direction. But again, it was so going from first, as I said, if you think about it, going from being around a cyclotron for 7 years to coming into state policy and trying to deal with politics and civil service and all this stuff, the governor, that was a big jump. And then going from state agencies, just about when I got comfortable understanding how that worked, to getting into setting up a small business and trying to figure out how to meet a paywall, how to get health insurance, all the things which, and it didn't have an MBA, it was the bottom line. So all the skill mix you needed to do a business. So that was like the next 20 some years.
A lot of on-the-job learning.
Yeah.
Although I'm sure after the first few years, I'm sure you fell into the swing of it.
Actually, the toughest thing was at the beginning because, again, I think it's funny because I had friends who did similar things. And some people would decide the first thing they would do is go work for a consulting firm for a couple of years, learn how to do a consulting firm, and then jump. Mm-hmm. So we had to learn on the job. And others went through the process of saying, okay, now how do you market yourself? What are your skills? What are your clients? How do you add value? And again, we had to more or less painfully get to that point of understanding the landscape enough, to basically have the business going and be successful. And, I think as I indicated, I did a lot of expert witness testimony. Mm-hmm. So I testified at the PUC 100 and sometimes, testified at FERC on some major cases, did some court testimony. So acting as an expert witness on a variety of topics. A lot of it was power stuff.
I mean, there were big changes in the California power markets. PG&E was going through bankruptcy.
Oh, yeah. No, I ended up – it was funny because so for a long time – there are areas where it's sort of like if you talk to people on employment law, you either work for the employers or the employees. You don't do – and similarly, if you're acting as an expert witness – again, you're going to get tripped up if you're sort of jumping around too much. So generally, I was working for the independent power producers, and most of the time the foil was PG&E and Edison, the utilities. And so I went through that part. Eventually, worked more for the banks on due diligence. Mm-hmm. As people were trying to say, okay, I'm investing in a project in California. Is this bankable or not? Was helping them do the evaluation of how bankable was it, how good were the contracts, what were the outs, what were the risks. And then I went from that part to, as you said, PG&E at some point went bankrupt. And my first set of clients were in the bankruptcy court trying to get the generators paid. So when PG&E goes bankrupt, when PG&E went bankrupt, people became creditors. Right? If you worked for PG&E, you were a creditor. If you had a contract to sell in power, you were a creditor. If you were a city that expected property tax payments, you were a creditor, right? Yeah. And so the court took all that complicated case. In some respects, it was easy in the sense that the company was financially solid, as it was caught in a regulatory mess. But anyway, I first worked with some of the generators to make sure they got paid, and then was hired by PG&E to help figure out how to get them out of bankruptcy. And at the same time, PG&E realized it needed a strategic planning group. And so I worked on setting up that within PG&E to try to help them think through what were the big issues they were facing and how to deal with those. Ultimately, when Peter Darby became CEO, he eliminated that group, but I have to say they need it probably worse now than ever. But but it was.
Let's just cut strategic planning.
Right? Yeah, exactly.
Who needs to think about the future?
Yeah, but that was it was anyway, it was very educational to go from one side to actually be inside the management committee meetings talking about what, whether to get into procurement or what were the biggest challenges they were facing. And then, getting them out of bankruptcy was really tough.
So fast forward to coming back here, because I want to make sure that we cover adequately your term as chair of the CEC. But you were appointed by Schwarzenegger.
Right.
And how did that come about? What was your appointment story?
I had so in the consulting firm, I had started phasing back. Mm-hmm. It's after 20 some years. It's like, and in fact, of my three of us who had originally founded it, the other two after about year 10, Dan Richard, one of the founders, had gone from there to be a vice president at PG&E, which is part of my entree into PG&E.
And he's now
chairman of high-speed rail.
Right.
And my other partner was Susan Morris. Susan had been at the Prudential and had set up the Prudential's first investments in alternative energy in the early 80s. She headed up their West Coast office, and actually was one of the first. She was MBA from Wharton, one of the first women in leadership role in a financial institution. So again, pretty powerful. But anyway, I had gone back to like 3/5 time, and I was trying to really scale back, and had been bought out of my share of the company. So I was sort of transitioning, trying to figure out what I was going to do next. And it was actually in Sacramento. I was talking to someone, and he's going, well, Art Rosenfeld's retiring, and I don't have a candidate for this. What are you doing next year? So I was like, okay. So I went home, talked to my wife. About a month later, I said, yeah, I guess I'll do it. And by then he had another candidate, but it's like I was sort of interested in going forward. And part of it was I was looking at the Energy Commission, and when I left the commission the first time, I got a letter from the governors, saying that I had brought to the commission, basically the Energy Commission was known for excellence in what it did, and it was not that way in 2008, so at the same time, I felt like the potential was there. It had a very fragmented commissioners, or they were a lot of infighting. And a lot of challenges. That was obviously the economy had really gone down in 2008. The Obama administration had put in place the ARA program, both grants and basically trying to kickstart the financial community by providing incentives for new power plants or solar plants, if you could actually get them permitted. Mm-hmm. And so the question was, how could the Energy Commission rise to the occasion? And at that point, Governor Schwarzenegger was very concerned about the economy and trying to do, and so he had appointed Picker as his czar to try to cut through the permitting issues, and talked to Michael, and Michael was looking for someone to come into the Energy Commission and help kickstart the permitting stuff. And so I basically came in. Karen Douglas was the chair then. Karen really focused on the ARA money part. Originally, she was working on the money and then the permitting, and over time, I picked up the permitting, and she stayed focused on trying to get the $300 million of grants out. Now, I came in, I was a Schwarzenegger appointee, and ultimately was not confirmed. Well, actually, the Senate never even had a hearing on me. The notion was if a Democrat was elected, then the Democrat would appoint, at some point, I think it was appointed I would say January, and, by about May or June, the Senate just said, we're not confirming anyone appointed by Schwarzenegger, including you. And if there is a Democrat elected, he or she will appoint, fill these positions. And if a Republican is elected, then we'll probably confirm you as fast as we can. And the only question, like I said, was whether they were going to confirm me before Meg Whitman pulled my appointment. Was she going to pull my appointment, or right. What was going to happen? And so when Governor Brown was elected, since we had the pre-existing relationship, that ultimately he decided he was going to appoint me. But in all the classic, obscure parts of history. So it turns out you can serve on the commission for 365 days without being confirmed. And after 365 days, you cannot serve for another year.
Really?
Even if on 366 the governor decides to appoint you, So on 3 days, 360, Governor Brown was basically sworn in, and I asked him, the first thing was to pull my appointment so it could park in limbo. And then eventually he appointed me. That started the clock, and the appointment had to be timed so I could go through the Senate vote in 5 days. It might have been 6, but anyway, there are different arguments of what the right count was. So anyway, I pulled through that part, and he appointed me both as, on the commission as the chair. Now, when we had the interview, the governor had mentioned in his campaign that he was trying to abolish the Energy Commission. So in the interview, he said, I'll give you a year. Either turn the place around or it goes.
Wow.
So that
Threw
meant
down the gauntlet.
Yeah. So that also meant when I came in as chair and dealing with the other commissioners, I said, look, I got a year. It's pretty clear, he'll probably take care of me if I don't pull it off. Maybe not, whatever. But if the place is gone in a year, that's too bad for you. Yeah. So I need your help turning things around. But under Schwarzenegger, I had really taken over the power plant siting. And I remember talking to the LA Times like in June or so. And the reporter said, well, you've got we had like 9 major solar projects. We had 2,100 megawatts of gas projects. It was just an amazing. And, these are very large footprint solar projects, very,
Sure.
Out in the desert, right? I mean, these are not, and you're trying to figure out how to be responsible permitting them. And anyway, it's a LA Times reporter, and he burst out and said, you guys are going to get any permitted this year. And we got 9 done, is the bottom line. It turned out then the technology changed, so solar thermal no longer made sense, and many of them flipped to become photovoltaic projects. Mm-hmm. But bottom line is we drove them through. They were tough to do, and frankly, sort of the first time anyone ever tried to do it, and some of it, you learn things. I mean, my 2 favorites. So one of the things we worked on was Ivanpah. Mm-hmm. And the 2 stories I remember from there was we really mapped out all the desert tortoise and the permitting side. And when they started construction, it turns out desert tortoise move. And so where we thought they were and how many there were a lot more, and they weren't where we thought they were going to be, So number one, but, just like, okay. And the other thing we found was one of those, so that one day the workers said they noticed all the desert tortoise suddenly started marching uphill. And they're trying to figure out what the hell was going on. It turns out this incredible storm came through, flash flood, really knocked out some of the stuff that was down where the tortoise had marched away from. So God knows how they knew, but yeah. But yeah, you learn that. You're also in some of it's like, oh God, there's more, Native American ruins than you thought there were. Anyway, bottom line is it was never pretty, but
siting is difficult.
Yeah, it was. But then, it was with the governor, the thing was with the Governor Brown had a pretty clear vision of where he wanted to go, pretty clear message to me on get there. At the same time, the commission, again, and we had really, in the first year, I basically said we were resetting a relationship with the legislature. Went through a lot of the management in terms of replacing people. Mm-hmm.
Cleaned house.
Yeah, it's just we did not have the confidence of the legislature. And in some respects, it was amazing. I mean, for the amount of things we did for people, we just got no credit for it. Yeah. A very bad job of explaining what we were doing and why we were doing it and what the benefits were to Californians. And that was, and again, it was definitely one of the things of saying, okay, let's look through the programs, make sure things make sense, shake up the management, get in a stronger team, get to the point where we've got comfort in the legislature that we're doing what we should be doing. And that was a pretty tough I think actually the thing which we ran into was on the ARA grants, that was sort of the make or break, frankly, in the first year. So we had given money to a lot of local governments to do innovative and creative things. And so, again, the auditor comes through and says, this money's not going to be spent. It's going to go back to the feds. And, these guys are just too screwed up to really make it happen.
Right.
And what we had to do eventually, and it was just pretty clear, we were going to do it or we were going to be gone. And so what we had to do, so you look at it and say, okay, we gave city X $10 million. And the person, whoever, the city manager who went in and said, we're going to do this for the $10 million, just because they're gone. Who's ever there has no idea why they have $10 million or what to do with it. Right. And so, we had to really go out, start auditing every one of the contracts. And if they weren't really moving on it, we had to sweep the money back, reallocate it, and say, okay, we've got a pot of money here. Any city who can come in and get it spent in this period of time, we'll give it to you.
And were you able to get through the...
Yeah, we were able to do it. But again, I remember just sitting at a legislative hearing being pounded on by our committee, saying, first of all, you guys can't manage your way out of a paper bag. And then second of all, I've got an audit here from the state auditor saying you're this is screwed up. You're not going to get the money out. And, I'm going to have you back here in 6 months to explain. And we got it out. I'd have to say a lot of the credit on that went to the executive director on that, but also we were finding, I remember coming into the building one day and, I ran into one of the recipients and he said, well, every month I come back, meet with your attorneys, it's a different attorney. And each time they have a whole different set of stuff they want from me before they're going to conclude the contract. And I said, no, we're going to just really make it happen. So again, a lot of what we've had to do, like I said, is sort of simple. Well, there's some fairly complicated stuff I have to deal with, but part of it was just basic management. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's just how do you...
Focusing on the operations.
Yeah.
So we've talked about, kind of the early days and the intersection of energy and environment and sort of how that came about. And your own evolution from being a nuclear chemist to really a career in energy and the different ways in which you've worked on the sector. Why are you doing the work now? What is it that motivates you?
Well, a couple of things. Obviously, I was going to say, I think having the governor say, I need you to do X, and having that relationship, there's a lot of reasons why I'm going to stick around through his term, and having said that, I have a feeling like what I'm doing is really making a difference. And frankly, I enjoy what I'm doing, so that combination of having the support of the governor, having an impact and liking what I'm doing, drives things in my mind. Now, again, it can be pretty grueling at times. There are times that what I'm doing is not necessarily that much fun, and other times where it's a lot of fun. But, in balance, it's been a very interesting time and a lot of variety, a lot of challenges, and I think making a difference.
What are you most proud of in the work that you've done at the commission?
Well, actually, there are two different times. It's probably best to distinguish between the two. I think in the first time, it was just fundamentally rethinking what California energy policy should be and basically starting to change the ship from what was a very conventional coal nuclear focus to really fundamentally shifting it to where we are now, in terms of energy efficiency, in terms of renewables, and really framing it in a way which helped to move things forward, even though, like I said, it was incredibly painful, but, God bless, people should be quite happy we don't have a 1,200 megawatt coal plant in the middle of the Bay Area, or one in the California desert, or Harry Island, Warner Valley.
That's right, and I think that the role that California is playing internationally on climate and energy, people tend to think about it in terms of AB 32 and in the last decade or so. But really, I mean, as you've pointed out, it had to do with a painful shift in paradigm that happened in the late 70s.
Yeah, and so in a way, I was involved in that part. Probably I could have moved on from that point and could have pointed to a pretty strong legacy, but then coming back in this era, being able to connect the dots a lot better and understand it, and frankly, I had no training in management or anything like that. So being able to step in as the chair and saying, okay, we're going to focus, we're going to get this stuff done. It's not a skill I had at that point. Now it's really, again, bringing the place back to where I think the governor and the legislature really rely on this agency a lot. And again, it's sort of more the collective thing now than sort of that more the earlier point, but even the earlier part, frankly. I mean, I had a really great staff working with me. It was really often in these things, you can be a catalyst, but it's not like you do these things by yourself. And so at this point, I mean, when you look back, I mean, there's a whole series of stuff now. I mean, obviously the recent Title 24 standards, I mean, the third climate assessment, we called out the fire issues. I mean, really getting our research program back together and getting, again, that's done really marvelous things. And, diversity policy, again, at this point, we have a very strong commitment to diversity in this agency, really strong, commitment to making sure all Californians are part of the energy transformation, looking at, like in our research program, we're putting 25% of the demos in disadvantaged communities. We're putting out metrics, draft metrics on how we can track our progress to make sure all Californians, including disadvantaged, are participating.
And that has really been a shift that I've seen even in the last few years in the way California approaches energy and climate. Earlier today, we wwere interviewing Assemblymember Garcia, and I think he has been a part of that. And what's beautiful to see, I mean, you described a disjuncture between the legislature and the Energy Commission, and a commission that was in rough shape when you took the chair years ago, and now it seems like it's really humming.
Yeah, no, and again, it's when we had the 40th, we had a picture of all the staff taken. You look around and say, God, there's a lot of white faces there. Some of them older, some of them younger, but again, really trying to push the agency hard in terms of opportunities for all Californians, and obviously that means reaching out with intern programs and other things to bring in, basically minorities. So again, that sort of transformation, and one of the things I knew coming back was, again, you just did the math. There were a lot of people who have been here for years who are going to be retiring at this stage. So trying to really set the place up for the new generation of leadership, was equally important. So it's been a pretty good run this time. Like I said, it really is taking, really shifting things from the focus at one stage was energy efficiency, how to use energy wisely, what was the economics, how to reduce environmental impact, to now our energy policy is really on climate policy. And we're still making some of the transformations, but it's very much driven by, you look around, you look at the fires, you look at it's clear climate change is happening now. And, we're not moving fast enough to deal with it, but we're certainly, trying to push really hard to get there, and provide that global leadership. As you said, we're like 1% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. So unlike before, here I am, probably, ever since the governor went to China on his first trade mission, where I went with him. I've gone to China like twice a year, probably on average since then.
You were just there a few weeks ago.
Yeah. I mean, and Germany. I mean, so much more international focus than before, but certainly very heavily focused on China and very heavily focused on what can we do to really address climate, realizing we can be an example for the world But, if you took California to zero, it would not really, that would not solve the issues. You really have to think globally.
It's the laboratory effect and the fact that it's taking place here amidst incredible economic growth.
Exactly.
And California is the fifth largest economy
we've gone
among nations, right?
We've gone up to number 5. No, I mean, it is the fundamental debate in China, if not India, of saying, how do we grow our economy, take care of all of our citizens, and address climate issues? And without California's example of how you could grow a sustainable economy, who knows if the Chinese would go in the direction they're now going? I mean, again, last year, they're half the photovoltaics in the world were installed in China. I mean, probably most of it manufactured, but half installed there. And again, that's a remarkable transformation. SEV, I mean, again, we're talking this year, they're going to have 1 million electric vehicles on the road by the end of the year. In this 1 year, they put like 500,000 in last year. So again,
that's tremendous.
So trying to move China is hugely critical, along with India. I mean, again, so that global action is something which, who would have thought? And again, when we first came in, when the budget was so bad, we couldn't afford to go to Tahoe, frankly, much less China. It's certainly the issues keep changing, but in terms of where the opportunities are, it is trying to innovation generally in our economy, and then trying to really get that innovation out elsewhere and figure out, well, how do you have a decent relationship with China, where they certainly want to invest here, but we're trying to coordinate policy, we're trying to coordinate innovation, and we're trying to coordinate investment.
So one last question, and on this note of innovation, California was at the forefront of energy efficiency. It's getting harder to squeeze more efficiency out of our energy sector, although we're still trying. As you look to the future, what single technology or sector are you most excited about?
Well, certainly the one that's the most challenging is transportation. I mean, part of it, again, as a scientist, I tend to think analytically on these things. So when you look, 50% of California's greenhouse gas emissions are from transportation, about 38 from vehicles, and then your refining is in production, gets you to 50. Power is like 20%. Half of that 20 is in-state, half is out-of-state. So if we can't crack the nut on transportation, we're losing. And in fact, if you look at the statistics through this Brown administration, we've done greenhouse gas emissions have gone down dramatically. Power we've cleaned up dramatically. With renewables, we're certainly, if you combine, basically, I'd have to say we're sort of ignoring, some when people come in and say, well, what about X, small Ireland, someplace that's like 100% hydro. But if you look at a major economy, top 10, we're certainly at the top when it comes to renewables, including hydro in the mix, with or without, but certainly including hydro. But transportation, we Californians love cars, and we're driving more, and we have more and more cars, we're driving more and more. And, trying to turn that around is critical. And how do you convince people to really start embracing, the sort of zero emission vehicles? We lead the country in that. We have about 280,000, which is 40-some% of the U.S. zero emission vehicles. But we've got, how many cars
to go?
Right. So there's always to go there. And we have to bend the curve fast because, again, certainly there's a lot of studies that indicate we're getting close to tipping point on climate. And so we need to start bending the curves pretty fast. And although California I'd have to say, is like an 11 out of a 10 scale on state action, it's still, we're not doing enough to address the challenge.
Well, that's a clarion call to those listening, and I want to thank you very much for your time and for your years of service.
Thank you.
Thanks again to the Sustainable Business Partner for the California Leadership Series, LIFT. To learn more about LIFT's carbon neutral program, visit lift.com/carbon. The Sustainability Leaders Podcast is a resource of Jobs with Impact. Our engineer and associate producer is Ian Swanke. Theme music is also by Ian Swanke. I'm David Rosenheim. If you like the show, please rate and review us on iTunes or your preferred platform. And be sure to tell your friends and colleagues who want to make a difference. Thanks for listening. See you next week.